For your research, have you been to castles, haunted places, things like that, to experience this yourself?
I'm not hunting for ghosts. I'm not trying or expecting.
You're not a ghost hunter. Okay,
No reality TV show on the horizon.
Today's guest is Dr. Martha McGill. Martha completed a PhD at the University of Edinburgh in 2016 with a thesis entitled Ghosts in Enlightenment Scotland. Her research interests are in Scottish religious culture, natural philosophy and folklore from the Reformation to the early 19th century. She also has a book coming out soon entitled Ghosts in Enlightenment Scotland. In this episode, we discuss with Martha how ghost stories get disseminated, what drives them, and how culture, religious beliefs, and the prevailing needs of the time impact their power and prevalence. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, do sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com. Now, get yourself settled in for this episode, Stories of Scottish Ghosts.
During my MSc, I was doing a bit of work in the National Library of Scotland. They have a lot of interesting manuscripts there. And I came across a set of manuscript letters telling a ghost story among a few other supernatural stories. And I was interested in this because they were letters from the early 18th century from Scotland. And in Scotland in this period, you weren't really supposed to be talking about ghosts. They were letters from a minister. And ghosts weren't really orthodox within the Scottish religious framework at the time. So I was curious as to why a minister would be passing around ghost stories. And that was really my starting point on all this. One of the really interesting things about it was that it was a story which recalled lots of medieval themes. In the medieval period, there's this idea that after you die, if you're absolutely awful, you go to hell. If you're a little bit awful but potentially redeemable, you go to purgatory. And you go through this process of torment there until you make your way to heaven. So most ghost stories are about ghosts returning from purgatory to speak to their family from there. And these ghosts go through an interesting process of transformation as they make their way through purgatory. So generally on their first appearance, they'll come dressed all in black, they'll be ugly, they'll be smelly. It's all a reflection of the kind of inner darkness, you know. And
Like a bit like Dorian Gray kind of thing.
Absolutely, the hideous soul displayed. And then as they make their way through purgatory, they start to change from black clothing into white clothing. They start to get prettier and they start to smell nicer. And these were the kind of themes going on in this story as well. This was a story from the late 17th century, told in the early 18th century, around 1707. And it was telling about a ghost who arrives first in black, then moves into white and starts to smell pretty and so forth. So I was really curious about why these medieval themes are surviving as well, as we're getting into a culture which has dismissed the idea of purgatory. Protestantism, you only have heaven or hell, there's nothing in between.
So from there was no purgatory, but still the stories of ghosts were still present. Why was that? So why are we still, these people were talking about ghosts?
Well, so first of all, yes, in the 16th century, we get the Reformation. In Scotland, it's in 1560 specifically. And ghost stories do disappear for a little while after that.
Okay.
The Protestant theologians are pretty uncomfortable with them. So basically, because you haven't got purgatory, there's this idea there's nowhere ghosts can come back from. You know, no one would ever want to leave heaven. No one would ever be allowed to leave hell. So it's impossible. The theologians are arguing this. And for about a century within Scotland, we don't really get ghosts coming through much in educated discourse. Very occasionally we'll get ghost stories, but they're fairly rare. They start to make a comeback within educated culture in the late 17th and the early 18th centuries. So at that point in time, there's a fear across Britain and a bit more widely that there are all kinds of dangerous new philosophies emerging in Europe. So people are looking at folk like René Descartes with his vision of a kind of materialist universe divided between mind and matter with no separate category for spirit. In England, there were folk like Thomas Hobbes, again proposing a materialist view of the world. And there's a terror that as a result of this, everyone's going to turn into atheists. So in an endeavour to combat this perceived wave of atheism that's going to overrun the country, ministers start taking up ghost stories, they start embracing them, they start retelling them, because ghosts can actually be really, really useful as religious propaganda.
It's they're brought back as a marketing campaign.
Exactly, yes. I mean, it's obviously pretty hard for us to tell what's going to happen after we die. Ghosts have a privileged insight into this. So you can tell these stories of ghosts who come back to say, oh, so, by the way, there's a heaven. I've been there. It's absolutely great. Make sure you behave yourself so that you can go there as well. Or you get stories of ghosts coming from hell to say, oh, my, it's been awful, you know, I've been getting burned by fire every day. Make sure you behave yourself again. So ministers can use them to demonstrate the reality of the Christian framework is the idea. So they start passing around these stories, telling these stories. And then at the same time, they always kind of hung on in folk culture. With the example of the medieval ghost that changes colour, that's an example of how these kind of traditions have survived, have been passed down over the generations. And I think that's very much about dealing with death and thinking about death. Folk stories of ghosts don't tend to take the same kind of religious propaganda element. They're very much instead about how death works and how as a community you should be thinking about it and talking about it. So you've always got that going as an undercurrent to society, and then the educated folks start getting involved again.
Just in terms of the power of that, I mean, that's a massive sort of PR campaign, marketing ploy that's there. Just from your view and your research and what you come across, is what is it about just the concept of ghosts and keeping that alive? How does that change how people live their lives? I mean, what's the power in that?
In terms of how much actual impact it has on people, it's hard to say. I mean, ghosts, of course, are just one facet of this much broader campaign of proselytizing. You know, you need to be good Christians all the time. And people are getting this drummed into them at church every week and so forth. You know, you need to be thinking about death. You need to be preparing for it. But the fact that they keep coming up with all of these new ways to try and get that message across suggests that it's perhaps not all that effective at any stage in the process. A lot of these ministers who are telling ghost stories justify it by saying, oh, people are far too hedonistic, you know, they're not thinking about the fate of their souls, they're just trying to enjoy themselves while they're here, and we need to find a way to change that. Do these stories actually achieve that? I'm dubious. Certainly they set out ways to live, and they're probably just another straw added to the camel about how you are going to die. Keep remembering that you're going to die. Keep thinking about it. Whether it's the one that actually, you know, breaks the back and causes some kind of flick in people's minds, I don't know. But I think ghost stories do perhaps serve to keep communities thinking about death and thinking about the kind of duties that they have to the dead, perhaps. So in a way, they're more about encouraging people to think about the dead than to think about themselves in terms of the actual impact that they have. Okay. So you see with the kind of stories that are circulating in folk culture, there's this really common theme of using ghost stories to talk about your duties to your ancestors. So back in the medieval period, when you've got ghosts returning from purgatory, these ghosts will very often say, I've come back because you're not saying enough prayers for me, so I can't make my way through purgatory. You need to be saying more prayers, or you need to be paying more money to the priest so that they'll say more prayers. And, you know, sometimes it is the priest circulating this story, so there's kind of possible mercenary objectives there. The other thing is ghosts coming back because their burials haven't been conducted properly. This, again, is really common. Ghosts coming back to say, I wasn't buried in the right bit of ground or whatever. Certainly when we get Protestantism in the 16th century, this is completely unorthodox. According to the Protestant church, no one bit of ground is more special than any other bit of ground. It doesn't matter whether you've had a priest say some fancy words over it. You know, it's all God's earth, so it does not matter where you are buried. But there's still this sort of strong tradition attaching importance to it. So there's one story from Scotland in 1635. It's about a man whose wife dies. My stories begin with somebody dying. On her deathbed, she says to him, "Oh, please make sure you bury me in the churchyard." But at the time when she dies, there's an outbreak of plague in the local area. And he's afraid that if he has this public churchyard burial, his friends will all assume that she died of the plague and they'll cut him off and refuse to make sport. So he comes up with this cunning plan to completely conceal her death, and he just buries her in his back garden. And it all backfires when her ghost starts to obsessively haunt him and his family. So he goes to consult the local clergy, and they tell him, "Oh, well, dig her up, have her buried in the kirkyard. That'll solve your problems." And he does, and the ghost Julie disappears. But this is just an example of this common strain of stories, upholding the idea that you owe certain things to the dead. You need to be conducting the burials in a certain way, perhaps saying certain kinds of prayers over them. And if you don't, you're depriving the dead of their chance to actually rest properly. It's not just about thinking about your own life and how you should be living that. These stories are also a way for communities to kind of remind each other of what you owe to your loved ones who are gone.
There's a motive behind all of the stories. It's said the prayer, the alms to the church, whatever it might be. From the folklore point of view, that's quite clear from a religious point of view. What do you think the messages are from the folklore end?
Yeah, so partly it's about this theme of you need to be burying your dead properly. The other really common thing that you get from the folkloric sources is the idea that you mustn't grieve the dead too much. The dead is something to be expected and accepted. One body of sources I spent a bit of time working with is ballads, traditional songs, which often tell of ghosts returning. And there's two particularly common themes which emerge from these. So one is ghosts coming back, again, to serve a sort of memento mori, reminders that you're going to die. So you get ghosts coming back, looking all sort of rotten and corpse-like. And they'll wander around among their old lovers and friends and so on and say, "Oh, I'm lying in the grave, I'm rotting, bits of me are falling off, I'm getting eaten by worms. Remember that this is going to happen to you too." It's cheerful stuff. But the other and perhaps more common theme actually is the ghost coming back to say, "Look, I'm trying to rest, or I'm trying to make my way to heaven, but you won't let me because you keep on grieving for me." So I'm walking through the valley of death on my way to the afterlife, and I'm wearing this shroud, and your tears are weighing my shroud down until it's so heavy that I can't move. So you need to stop crying for me.
That's fascinating because, just with a lot of, in terms of lot of people we've spoken to so far, it's the idea of the acceptance of death, that it happens to us all. And it's like that letting go, that clinging aspect. So that's an interesting message, that one.
We tend to think of past cultures as having been a bit better at this, partly by necessity, partly because, at the period I'm looking at, life expectancy was under 30 for the most part. So, death is something you're surrounded by all the time. And death is part of your community in a way that it's not so much nowadays. You've talked about this in the past, but, it's before the period where we're moving death out into hospices and that kind of thing. Death is something that happens within the community. Your local folk then strip the body and bathe it and dress it, and usually you'll have a wake, you'll have a party around the body for the night before it's then buried the next day. There's often this idea that because death is a constant within these communities, they're generally better at handling it. Ghost stories do suggest that there's still a lot of trauma attached to it and a lot of confusion over how exactly you should be thinking about it, what you owe to your loved ones. They have, of course, this Christian framework through which to think about it, this idea that death is a blessing because hopefully you're going on to a better place. But I'm not sure how much it actually helps. These stories do suggest that people still have a lot of trouble with coming to terms with it and with, trying to feel the Christian joy that they ought to feel when their child dies.
I'm a bit curious, actually, to know how these death stories emerge or are created. When I was a child, there's always a friend of a friend of a friend who had kind of a spiritual or meta ghost or something very extraordinary happened to her or to him. So these stories are passed on, but From your studies, how have they generated, how have they created? Is it because they don't understand things or phenomena and they just something's built up? So what is your take on that?
This is really hard to answer. It's a good question.
I don't know.
I mean, it's the same as you were saying. It's always this theme of a friend told me that his friend saw this thing. It's very, very rare actually to get first-hand accounts of experience with ghosts. It happens, but it's much, much more common to get, it's traditionally told that in this area there's this ghost and it's been seen these times and so forth. Or to get my grandmother's second cousin, once removed, was, staying out at this lonely farm, etc. When it comes to actually tracing at what point these stories emerged and therefore why they emerged at that point, it's difficult. It's usually impossible to do with individual stories, with a few exceptions. I mean, the thing you can do is say, well, we get a group of this kind of story circulating at this particular point in time. Okay. So this kind of story probably speaks to a certain kind of vision of death or a certain kind of set of religious priorities or whatever. So in the medieval period, for example, there's a big fashion for stories of revenants. Revenants are basically walking corpses. They're like the modern day zombies.
Okay.
There's a story from Melrose Abbey in the Borders of a priest who isn't quite as priest-like as he should be. He very much enjoys hunting during his life. He gets this nickname, the Hundepriest, or the priest of the hounds. After he dies, presumably because he hasn't lived a sufficiently godly life, he finds it very difficult to actually rest. He's laid down to rest in the graveyard beside the local monastery, but he keeps getting up out of his grave and walking around. He goes and terrorizes the local monks, and he goes and pays his addresses to his former lover. And this is very, very much a physical, well, literally a walking corpse. He's trailing bits of soil after him. The way that this revenant is eventually laid is the local monks go and stay up all night at the graveyard with axes. And when the revenant gets up, they go and chop him up, essentially. And then they burn the remains. So these are very, very, very physical, corporeal kinds of ghosts. This is fashionable in the medieval period. And it reflects in a way the medieval fascination with corpses and the skeletons. Medieval art is full of this stuff. They love dead bodies. Then progressively as you move through time, ghosts start to get more incorporeal, more ethereal. So there's a kind of gradual shift towards this. It's probably solidified in the later 18th century when Gothic literature starts to take off and popularizes the idea of a kind of gliding white, shimmering ghost. It's quite perhaps beautiful. It's probably sort of translucent. And it's probably become the modern stereotype, that type of ghost. There are different ways that ghosts are framed. Ghosts are thought about according to kind of different priorities in each sort of different point of time. And this also applies, of course, to the ghosts that are used for religious propaganda in the late 17th, the early 18th century. Then in the later 18th century, it's much more about using ghosts as literary devices. So there's a kind of shift in how they're portrayed, so that it's less about reflecting on the afterlife, more about telling romantic, dramatic stories full of, love and bloodshed and all that kind of thing, presenting a certain kind of vision of Scotland as a haunted country as well. So in terms of looking at where stories come from, it's hard to say, but looking over a large time span, you can see that the kind of major themes in stories do change according to the priorities of different generations.
So it seems to be like whatever the prevailing mindset or philosophy was at the time just seems to get wrapped up in the stories.
Absolutely,
Yeah, okay.
I'm sure, or maybe tell me, for your research, have you been to castles, haunted places, things like that, to experience this yourself?
I'm not hunting for ghosts. I'm not trying or expecting.
You're not a ghost hunter. Okay,
no reality TV show on the horizon.
I mean, I wish someone would make one. I'm sure it'd be fun. But honestly, for most of the period that I look at, so I focus on the period from about the Reformation in 1560 up to the early 19th century. For most of that period, places are not as associated with ghosts as they are now. It's something that comes in the late 18th, the early 19th century. Back in the 16th and 17th centuries, ghosts return to people because they've got this specific objective. They've got some message that they want to communicate to another individual. So they appear to a person, they pass on their message, and then usually they stop returning thereafter. This is in the majority of stories. You, of course, get exceptions, especially in the folkloric material, but that's the common trend. It's only in the late 18th century when, again, Gothic literature starts to take off, and when in Scotland we get a big romanticisation of the landscape, that you start to get the association between ghosts and castles, ghosts and old ruined monasteries. And you start to get this idea of ghosts haunting places, and haunting places for a long, long period of time as well. So you get ghosts without any kind of specific purpose, ghosts that aren't delivering any useful moral message, therefore, ghosts that are just lingering around in an area. And then they stop being so much about religious propaganda or anything and start instead becoming a kind of expression of Scottish identity. They get tied up in these conceptions of Scotland as a haunted country and the Scottish landscape as beautiful and wild and so forth. So it's a kind of, part of a broader process of romanticising Scotland rather than being about religious priorities. You
said ghosts sort of appeared to individuals and they nearly all had a message. I mean, just how much of that do you think could be down to just maybe someone... it could be down to guilt or some psychological thing where people aren't letting go of something and these become projections. So they're almost giving them the message themselves.
Of course, it's always sort of slightly uncomfortable to try and look into the minds of people who lived hundreds of years ago, and sort of start trying to psychoanalyze them. But yeah, I'm sure you're right, really. I mean, you do see from the 18th century, as the Enlightenment gets going, there's a growing body of scholarship that argues that that's exactly what ghosts are. They're figments of the imagination. They're reflections of your psyche in one way or another. Perhaps they're flaws in your vision. It's causing you to see hallucinations, or maybe you're drunk. Or yes, perhaps they're reflections of something deeper, some kind of psychological problem or psychological preoccupation. Even in the 18th century, we are definitely getting that coming through as a sort of actually fairly popular interpretation of ghosts. It's always the one I come back to when people ask me, why are there so many stories of ghosts? You're trying to deal with losing somebody you love and so forth, trying to feel that there's this continued connection or feel like you have done your duty by them. So it's about guilt or loss in one way or another.
It feeds back into the memento mori thing and the folklore, the letting go process. It's like there seems to be a lot encapsulated just in that piece.
Of course, it's hard. We all know it's hard to deal with the idea that somebody's gone forever. And ghost stories allow you that point of continued connection. I mean, people talk about how the Enlightenment turned us all into rationalists. I'm not convinced by that because there's still plenty of ghost stories around. And I think it's just because we still don't really have a way to deal with death properly yet within society. So people cling on to ghost stories as a way of feeling that continued point of connection. And, go to mediums to try to talk to their deceased relatives and that kind of thing as well. What's
the future of ghost, of this ghost story? Because if you look at the moment, we still talk about supernatural stuff, all the day. It's always there at this moment. But we have all this scientific progress. We know stuff a lot more than before, but still supernatural is part of our life today. Do you think that one day it will be over, or will still continue to have this kind of supernatural? What do you believe?
I think it's always going to be there in some shape or form. Yeah. I mean, you do see that different kinds of supernatural move in and out of fashion over time. Yeah. So ghosts, as I've said, go quiet for a while after the Reformation, and there's a much bigger focus on witches and their activities within European society generally. Then ghosts make this big comeback in the later 18th and 19th century. They're going away for a while in the first half of the 20th century, then they're making a comeback since the 1950s. Ghost belief has been increasing in Britain. You get arguments that, ghosts get displaced by UFOs at certain point in time, for example. So that's how strange apparitions are getting interpreted. I think we move between focusing on different kinds of weird things, but weird things of some sort or another are always going to be there, I think. Because people want an explanation that appeals on an emotional level as well as just a mental level, as well as just the level of rationality. I mean, it's interesting thinking about the medieval revenants that zombies have made such a big comeback in modern culture. That again is something that disappeared for a while, and nowadays we're obsessed with zombies. We're talking about zombie apocalypses, with games about zombies, with programs about zombies, etc. And I don't have an explanation for this. I don't know why we now, over the last few decades, we've developed this fascination with walking corpses again. I think, again, that kind of need to see something beyond the purely sort of scientific in the world is always going to get an outlet in some kind of weird thing or another, some sort of supernatural being. The precise type will vary.
It's a way of filling the gaps, isn't it? Because there's always those unknowns, and it's just that explanation that we seek, that meaning behind it. But it is interesting. I'm just wondering, is there anything on a wider scale, as you said, the way they come, they go, and even the types? It's always fascinating me is what is the driver behind that? What's going on in the, if you like, the greater psyche that makes that popular?
I have no idea. I mean, in the last few decades, of course, the media has such a major role in it now. The media is playing an important part in shaping how we think about the supernatural, whether it's shows about zombies or whether it's Twilight making vampires popular or whatever it might be. So we've got that to look at now as something guiding what becomes fashionable and what we like to talk about in terms of the supernatural. Of course, we also have the thing of a declining religious belief in contemporary Western society, meaning that we're not obsessively trying to fit things into a Christian framework, and we're not only looking at things that can be explained through that Christian framework. It gives us more freedom in modern society to look at a much wider range of weird stuff. Whereas, a few centuries ago, the weird stuff had to be conformable with Christianity somehow or other if educated folk were going to publish about it. In terms of actually explaining what makes the media focus on certain elements rather than others, and then what makes us interested in those elements, I don't know, I'm afraid.
That's okay. I'm very curious about, studying about that, publishing about that, teaching about that. How does it change you yourself in your daily life with this relationship with death and ghosts and the supernatural? How does it play in your life?
It hasn't made me more superstitious. I suppose another reason you get these stories surviving is that it's pretty common to see things out of the corner of your eye, or to hear odd creaking in your house at night, that you can't necessarily explain. For me now, that triggers a whole wave of associations and a whole wave of kind of stories that links up to, and I automatically start placing myself within this context of centuries and centuries worth of people who have heard these noises and have tried to think about them and tried to make sense of them. So I suppose it's made me more conscious to all the little things that happen on a daily basis that are hard to explain. It hasn't made me want to stray away from finding a scientific explanation for them. I suppose I do a lot more thinking about death than I used to, and thinking about how to approach death. I know this is something you look at in the podcast, this thing that we should all be trying to think about death more. And it is useful from that point of view to think about how ghost stories, first we were saying, reflect the kind of guilt and regrets that people have around the death of their loved ones and so on. I think there is value in seeing them as a reminder that you should be trying to tie up your loose ends, trying to do your duties to your loved ones before they die.
I've read on your bio, I think, that you're working on angels as well, or things like that as well. Is it something that you do? Or?
That's my most recent project, yeah. So I'm working on two things mainly at the moment. One is my book on ghosts, which is due with the publishers by January, so I need to be cracking on with that.
Good luck with that.
Good luck.
But yeah, my newest project is on beliefs about angels, which is partly about the theology and philosophy behind angels. Again, the idea of angels actually appearing on Earth and visiting men is something Protestants are fairly uncomfortable with. So why and when these stories get told is interesting. And then I'm also interested in folkloric views of angels, people's ideas of guardian angels coming to save them and help them out of wells. There's this big theme in Scotland, stories of people falling into wells and having angels come along to help them out. Not sure what that's all about.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.